Bucham Abayim to the 19th in the series of lectures on the 13 principles of faith of Maimonides, that is the Yud Gimel Ikkarim of the Rambam. And with this 19th shiur, the 19th lecture, we're up to the last of the Ikkarim of the Rambam, that's the 13th. And that's the Ikar of Techiyat HaMeitim, which is the resurrection of the dead. And the Rambam says that the Yisod HaShlosh is Techiyat HaMeitim Kuvar B'Yanu. We've already explained it. In other words, that the Rambam does not elaborate very, very much on Techiyat HaMeitim, and he refers to the reader what he's written, right, in different places, in the Akdama, etc., etc. Now, needless to say, the subject of the Rambam's belief in the resurrection of the dead is, if not one of the, what's usually called, of the Maimonidean controversies, is probably the Maimonidean controversy. And the controversy actually expresses itself, in fact, actually what the Rambam speaks in Hilchot Teshuva. In Perek Shmini in the Mishnah Torah, right, the Rambam speaks about Olam HaBa, right? There the Rambam says, basing himself on the Gemara and Rav Yud Zayin in Brachos, where the Gemara says in Olam HaBa there's no Achila, there's no Amid, Shtia. The Rambam says, right, in halacha ches, perek halacha zeh shekol oisei chacham Olam HaBa, that which Chazal call Olam HaBa, lo mebnei she'enu motzi ata v'zeh Olam Ovei v'achach yova oisei Olam. It's not speaking about a world that will take place in some time of history. In other words, when this world is destroyed, then comes another world. In a double case, it's not true. Hu matzoi ba'oimei. Olam HaBa is something which exists all the time, right? Asher tzafanta, shedim asher tzafanta polos. V'lo karo Olam HaBa el b'nei she'yisrael chayim b'ayinu l'adam achachai Olam hazeh. It's called Olam HaBa because the state of Olam HaBa exists after the physical world. Shanu kayim b'ay guf nefesh. And of course, says the Rambam in Olam HaBa, explains Olam HaBa in halacha vav, right? Right? HaTorah Gedola, I'm reading now from halacha vav. Shetiya ba nefesh b'Olam HaBa ein shum derech b'Olam hazeh l'asiga. We can understand how it is. She'enu yodim b'Olam hazeh elo tovas haguf v'la anu metaven. There's Olam HaBa, we only know things that are physical. V'oiz HaTorah Gedola ad ma'oy ve'en lo erech b'tovas she'Olam hazeh. Right? There's no comparison to this physical world, right? But what is Olam HaBa, right? So the Rambam explains in Halacha Beis, Olam HaBa ein bo guf v'geviyah, right? There's no physical body. On the fashus tzadikim belvad b'loy guf k'malachei hashavetz. In other words, you only have the souls of the tzadikim, like the angels. No eating, no drinking. The Ram now is quoting the Gemara in Brachos, you're talking about Aleph. In other words, there's no physicality in the next world. It says the Rambam, Tzadikim yoishvin v'ataraseyim b'rosheyim v'nene b'zivashchina. It says the Rambam, this will all say that there's no eating, no drinking, but rather tzadikim are basking in the Ziv HaShechina. Harin Nizbalacha she'ein shem guf lefi she'ein shem achil v'shtiya. So what does it mean tzadikim yoishvin, single sitting? So al derech hachida, it's a metaphor, right? And what is atos b'roshayim? Says the Rambam. Kloima da she'edu v'glala zoch l'Olam HaBa. That's man's knowledge, his intellect. V'yatorah shalayim ki'inim shama shlomo hatorah she'ato lo'imay. So according to the Rambam, basically, and what is then Misiv HaShechina? She'yodim masikin misas HaKadosh Baruch Hu ma she'ein yodim ve'hem beguf ha'ofel ha'shafel. In other words, says the Rambam, then Misiv HaShechina means that the tzaddikim will sit and will intellectually connect, apprehend the truth of the Creator, which of course can only be done if there's no element of physicality. Says the Raavad. No, so what does the Rambam say? The Rambam has said, I actually went backwards in the Rambam. The Rambam says that Olam HaBa, the next world, is not a period in history. It rather exists now. But it's a different dimension of existence that Tzaddik can go after the neshama of the soul leaves the body. And there, the soul connects intellectually, apprehends intellectually the Creator in a physical, in a non-physical state. Says the Raavad, the several Raavads here, in halacha base, Amar Avon, Divrei zeh ha'ish ve'enai kroiv l'mi she'omer ein tchias ha'meisim l'gufos el neshamas b'lvad. The words of the Rambam are very close to the opinion of those of a person who would say that there's no tchias ha'meisim, no physical, only to the neshamas. V'chai Rosh me'olam lo hayadas chok ve'talmud al zeh. Says the Raavad, this was not the opinion. There's no opinion, right, among the sages of this, right? And the Rambam there quotes Gemaras and Ksufis and Sanhedrin that in fact actually that in the time of the resurrection the tzaddikim will stand again, will rise again within their physical bodies. Okay, so in other words, here already the Raavad, if not accusing the Rambam of heresy, at least opposing the opinion of the sages, implies that the words of the Rambam are very close to that. And the Rav repeats what he says, right? That in halacha ches, right? That which the Rambam says that Olam HaBa, the world to come, is not an epic in history that will follow, right? The history of our world. Says there's the Raavad is if he denies that the world will revert to chaos, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu will renew the world. Like I said, this is in Sanhedrin, that the world history will be 6,000 years, and then it will be destroyed, and then God will renew the world. In other words, basically what the Raavad is clearly saying is that Rambam appears to be rejecting the words of the sages, which suggest that Olam HaBa, right, means that there will be a physical resurrection, and that this will take place at a time of history after the 6,000 years of normative history, and this the Rambam appears to be rejecting. Okay, now, needless to say, right, that there is much ink has been spilled on this, and I think it's it would be really a waste of time for us to review this Rambamian controversy. The fact is that the Rambam, in fact, wrote a very famous Iggeres, a famous letter which is called the Maamar Techiyat HaMeitim, letter of the resurrection of the dead, in which the Rambam himself answered those people who accused them of not believing literally in the resurrection of the dead and taking the words of Chazal, the sages, as nothing but a metaphor, as a mashal. And the Rambam devotes a very, very famous epistle, right, towards answering his critics, and he certainly had very many critics during his lifetime. And of course, whenever the Rambam answered his critics, this also too has been subject to much interpretation. There are no scholars who actually took him at face value, believed him. Scholars wanted to say that even his apologetics and Techiyat HaMeitim did not actually dispel suspicions, etc., etc. Once again, this is also part of modern controversy. And the fact is that Techiyat HaMeitim does actually appear in the Yad HaChazaka too. That which we read concerning Olam HaBa, there we read that in Perek Ches in Hilchot Teshuva, but in Perek Gimel in Hilchot Teshuva, there the Rambam gives a list of those people who, by virtue of the beliefs, do not get Olam HaBa. So the Rambam in Perek Gimel halacha vav in Hilchot Teshuva writes, "Ve'elu she'ein lehem chelek Olam HaBa." These are those who do not have any chelek, any portion of the world to come. Right? Says the Rambam, Haminim, these are minim. We've spoken about this in previous lectures in the series, Apikosim, Koifim Batera, for Koifim Techiyat HaMeitim. In other words, the Rambam said the person is Koifim Techiyat HaMeitim if he rejects or denies the Techiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead. He's a person who's in Olam HaBa. This is actually for the Gemara Sanhedrin. So we see clearly that in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam does mention Techiyat HaMeitim, and it would appear from the language of the Rambam, since he actually uses Techiyat HaMeitim and doesn't use Olam HaBa, the Techiyat HaMeitim here is in fact actually literally the resurrection of the dead. Now, what's interesting is that the Techiyat HaMeitim, if one were to argue and take the devil's advocate, the Techiyat HaMeitim is not referring to the resurrection of the dead, but is speaking about Olam HaBa. I mean, the question would be, why does the Rambam use the language Techiyat HaMeitim and not Olam HaBa? However, there have been arguments advanced that when the Rambam says Techiyat HaMeitim, he really means Olam HaBa, which means not to take the Rambam's word literally. Now, this, of course, is also much ink has been spilled on this. I would like to in fact, actually quote from Professor Marc Shapiro in his book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, which is an exposition of both the 13 principles and the various opinions on them. So Professor Shapiro says, this is actually, I'm quoting from Professor Shapiro, beginning page 150. In the last paragraph, Raavad, the Raavad, in his critical gloss on Mishna Torah, Hilchot Teshuva, had already interpreted many words in this very writing. The word this made appear to be something to one who says that there's no resurrection for bodies, only for souls. And the Raavad was led to this view because, now on page 451, Maimonides mentions nothing about resurrection, discussion of life and death in the Mishnah Torah. Hilchot Teshuva, chapter 8. This could also imply that elsewhere Maimonides writes that one must believe in resurrection. He's actually done it with the world to come. In other words, that I think this is what Professor Shapiro is saying is when Rambam writes Techiyat HaMeitim, good about me, he means Olam HaBa. In support of this approach, so this is this is Professor Shapiro speaking himself, which suggests the following. In Hilchot Teshuva, chapter 3, this is the halacha that I just read, Maimonides defines the different types of heretics who have no share in the world to come. In his various list, he includes all the 13 principles with the exception of the 11th principle, reward and punishment. Many have wondered how Maimonides could have omitted this, especially since the most fundamental aspect of reward and punishment is the fact of the soul in the next world. Right? That's the Rambam, to fill in what Professor Shapiro is saying. The Rambam begins Parak Shmini, HaToivat Tzvul Tzadikim, the good, which is the reward that is hidden and awaiting the tzaddikim, is Chayei Olam HaBa. This is Olam HaBa. And the Gemara says, right, by Alma, Leis Chama Almas was Klal, but the Ikka Chama is in Olam HaBa, where it says in several places. So, it says, right, so in other words, many have wondered how Maimonides omitted this. This is Chava Oynish, which is one of the Ikkarim. Places the most fundamental aspect of the word punishment is the fact of the soul of the next world. Isn't denying spiritual world, which is actually denial of the soul mortality, a prime example of heresy? Did even more so than all the others he lists. In other words, a person denies Chava Oynish, reward and punishment. It's also heresy. It's one of the Ikkarim, one of the 13 principles. However, he says, if we assume the resurrection of death, which is a good chapter, really means the mortality of the soul, if Techiyat HaMeitim here means Olam HaBa, it makes sense. That, in other words, in Techiyat HaMeitim, the Rambam is actually speaking about Chava Oynish, reward and punishment, in which case, since the ultimate reward isn't the next world to come, Olam HaBa, so the Rambam Techiyat HaMeitim, he means Olam HaBa. And Professor Shapiro brings proof of this. He says, in fact, in Hilchot Teshuva, mindless resurrection for the coming of the Mashiach. You learn, right? If resurrection refers to life after death, then it makes sense to replace it for the Mashiach. Because Olam HaBa is not in any specific time, it's now. Just reward and punishment precedes the Mashiach in the 13 principles. Okay, fine. Now, first of all, so in other words, Professor Shapiro wants to understand, at least if we go according to the Raavad, that Techiyat HaMeitim here, right? Techiyat HaMeitim here means Olam HaBa. And he brings two proofs. So this one proof is that why does the Rambam leave out Chava Oynish? Right? Why does he leave out, right? That's one of the Ikkarim. And the second thing is, why does Chesed proceed Bias Hagoya? I would like to respectfully argue on Professor Shapiro's point for several reasons. First of all, I'm quoting now from the Maamar Techiyat HaMeitim. Now, I'm reading from the Rabbi Kapach's translation. That's the one I have in my house. Right? So, in Chelik Vav, section Vav, in the Kapach edition, it's Pei Vav, 86, Daf Pei Vav, 86. So, this is the translation from the Arabic. If those of you know Arabic in the land, there he reads the original Arabic. Other people have made a mistake at the end. In other words, he says, that what you say at the very end of the Mishnah Torah, where he speaks about Mashiach. You shouldn't think, the Rambam is actually quoting himself. We don't think that the Melech Mashiach has to actually make miracles. Right? Don't think that's to resurrect the dead. There the Rambam says that he brings a proof that this is not necessarily true, and also the proof is that Rabbi Akiva thought that Makofa could be the Mashiach. So one of the people basically, use a very insulting, use an insult. Chalushi bala'iyah means I don't really know what to think. So someone wanted to interpret this as that the Rambam, in fact, actually was rejecting Techiyat HaMeitim. Says Marc Shapiro, there was a Mishnah, Techiyat HaMeitim, he says Torah. This is contradicting what I said in the Torah. Because the Pashut ain't both Sovik will estate. The Rambam says there's no contradiction, it's Pashut. For who? Sha'anu Amanu, Shemashiach ain't the Drishim just a Meisim Gon Shir Krasawa. We don't have to demand the Mashiach actually do a wonder. Like splitting the sea. Or Yechaya Meisim or Derech HaMeifis. He doesn't have to resurrect the dead either. The Nevi'im already promised this. The aim of Mashma Lashon Zeh, Shashem doesn't mean the Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to resurrect the dead. In other words, the Mashiach doesn't have to do miracles. God do miracles. Kadosh Baruch Hu will resurrect the dead when he wants, the way he wants. Kasher Yirza, the way he wants. Whoever he wants. He can resurrect the dead. He can resurrect even, says the Rambam, God can resurrect the dead either during the Moshe Mashiach, or before the Moshe Mashiach, or after the Mashiach dies. In other words, says the Rambam, that the Techiyat HaMeitim does not, in fact, have to take place after the Moshe Mashiach. And therefore, even though in the Ikarim, the Rambam lists Techiyat HaMeitim after Mashiach, the fact is that when the Rambam refers to the Mishnah Torah here, he makes a point that Techiyat HaMeitim is not an act that we attribute to the Mashiach. And the Rambam says Techiyat HaMeitim can take place before Mashiach. And for this reason, in my opinion, this is why Techiyat HaMeitim actually precedes this listing in Hilchot Teshuva before what's called Bias Hagoya, which is your Mashiach. So in other words, the fact that the Rambam, and of course we believe what the Rambam says, the Rambam certainly understood that Techiyat HaMeitim is not contingent upon Mashiach, and perhaps he bedafka. There was maybe the Rambam in fact actually places this before the Bias Hagoya to illustrate this point that Techiyat HaMeitim is an act of God. It's a miracle. The miracle is not something that we demand from the Mashiach. So I think that answers one of Professor Shapiro's point, the second point. Now, the question is, why is there no Schava Oynash? So, I want to go into that in detail. First of all, the Rambam is listing people who have no chelik in Olam HaBa. I'm looking at a list of people who have no chelik in Olam HaBa. So why should I say a person is a legal Schava Oynash? It doesn't make sense. I'm telling you, if you don't believe in these things, you have no chelik in Olam HaBa. That's your Oynash. about, I don't have to list a belief in Chava Oynish, because I'm already telling you that if you don't believe these things, you get an Oynish, you're not getting Olam HaBa. In other words, Oynish, Chava Oynish, these are, it's like, in other words, Chava Oynish is related to, is a consequence of not believing these things. So I can't list people who get an Oynish of Olam HaBa and say those who don't believe in, if you don't believe in Oynish, so who am I writing to? So because of this, I claim that the Rambam doesn't include Chava Oynish. Now, the fact is,
the Gemara in Sanhedrin brings the Mida Keneged Mida. The reason a person doesn't get Olam HaBa is because they don't believe in Olam HaBa. Because
but still it's called an Oynish. There's a difference though. That's different. That's once again a consequence of that. All I'm saying is that I can't say, I can't make a list of people and say if you believe this, then you don't get Olam HaBa, and one of this if you don't believe it's Chava Oynish. I'm telling you what the punishment is. In other words, I can't speak. I'm telling you the Oynish. So therefore I can't. So it's a quid pro quo. In other words, it would be ridiculous for the Rambam to say if you don't believe Chava Oynish, you're getting this Oynish. What are you talking about? You don't believe it anyways. Who am I writing to? That's what I want to say. Number one. Number two, I want to say even further. Let's look at Hilchot Teshuva, the way the Rambam crafted Hilchot Teshuva, because I think this is a very important point. Now, first of all, it's very, very interesting that the Rambam doesn't also bring Briyesh Mi'ayin. We spoke about that. He does bring Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu is Enu Rishon V'tzul Hakol, and from the glasses of the Raavad, it would seem that the Rambam doesn't mention the Briyesh Mi'ayin. Doesn't bring creation ex nihilo. Right? It doesn't bring that. What the Raavad mentions, right? Adds to it, the concept of Briyesh Mi'ayin, but the fact is that the Rambam doesn't mention this. Now, in the when I spoke about the principle of Kadmos earlier in the Gimel Ikkarim, I mentioned the fact that really Briyesh Mi'ayin comes about in free will. So in fact, actually, Briyesh Mi'ayin actually appears really in Perek Hamisha, in Hilchot Teshuva. In other words, the Rambam here was interested in just saying Kadosh Baruch Hu is Rishon V'tzul Hakol. He's the creator. And we spoke about the dichotomy between proving God is the creator and proving that he created ex nihilo. The dichotomy meaning that the proof that God is the creator implied in the Rambam's proof in the beginning of the second part of the guide that the world was called. So therefore we had a paradox. So we asserted that the Rambam is there were two aspects to this. So therefore, in that sense, what the Rambam is saying here is that and I think we mentioned that in Perek Gimel, the Rambam was speaking about God as the creator, that he's the lone creator. The Briyesh Mi'ayin pops up in Perek Hey, where the Rambam speaks about free will, because creation ex nihilo is the basis of free will. That's how he explained it. Now I want to claim that Chava Oynish, even though it's not listed in Perek Gimel, because there the Rambam speaks about punishment. So we're assuming, of course, that a person is being punished. The Rambam is telling you, if you don't believe these things, you're punished. So therefore the Rambam is assuming you believe in punishment. But where does the concept of Chava Oynish pop up again? It pops up in Perek Ches. Because there the Rambam speaks about the ultimate reward. The ultimate reward being Olam HaBa, and the ultimate punishment being cut off from Olam HaBa. So in other words, if I look at the way the Rambam has architected Hilchot Teshuva, it turns out that through Perek Gimel, the Rambam, of course, begins by speaking about the concept of tshuva, and then speaks about those people who are punished and have no chelik in Olam HaBa, which means that these people are people who, I guess, at the end don't get to the tshuva, right? And then after the Rambam speaks about, in other words, speaks about these details, concept of tshuva, and people who are punished and therefore won't be able to do tshuva, they won't get Olam HaBa. Then the Rambam already in Perek Hey continues and starts speaking about the ultimate purpose of man. In other words, in Hilchot Teshuva, the first 4 chapters deal with the laws of tshuva. How does a person do tshuva? Who can't do tshuva? In chapter 5, the Rambam now continues, but instead of speaking about the laws of tshuva per se, he extends tshuva to the ultimate purpose of man. Now, of course, the ultimate purpose of man of the Rambam is his connection with God, which as the Rambam speaks about, we spoke about this too in chapter 17, section 3 of Mervucha, in terms of his intellect and his free will. Intellect and free will for the Rambam are one and the same. As the Rambam says, the planets, right, which are endowed with intellect also have free will. For the Rambam, free will and intellect are two sides of the same coin. And there the Rambam speaks about the ultimate purpose of man in chapters 5. And finally, in chapter 8, he speaks about Olam HaBa. Which means for the Rambam, the laws of tshuva are part and parcel of a greater ontological process, which in fact, by man being endowed with free will, grants him access to the ultimate truth, the ultimate purpose of the world, which is communing his intellect with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, with God. And that's Olam HaBa. So in other words, the Rambam understood that the halachic process of tshuva and the halachic laws of belief, which are Ikkarim, are embedded in a much more of a cosmic, philosophical process by which man achieves ultimate knowledge of God, which is the purpose of the Torah and the purpose of man's creation. That's what the Rambam is doing. So therefore, what I want to claim is that the notion of schar va'onesh, the Rambam saw as being inseparable from this ultimate purpose of man, being Olam HaBa, in which man, by being granted intellect, which the Rambam defines as the tzelem in the image of God, is finally achieved its purpose and teleological end in Olam HaBa. And therefore, the Rambam placed schar va'onesh, just like the Rambam understood that creation ex nihilo, which is the basis for man's imitation of God and his connection with God's intellect, is free will, and the Rambam put that in chapter 5, transferred schar va'onesh as part of the more philosophical process by which man achieves his purpose, and that's in Olam HaBa. So in other words, that's how the Rambam architected Hilchot Teshuva. So in which case, what I would say is that in the Yud Gimel the Rambam speaks about schar va'onesh, there he uses more in a utilitarian sense, because I have to be schar va'onesh before I speak about Limits of Mashiach and Techiyat HaMeitim, man. These are the things Limits of Mashiach has to do when Klal Yisrael does tshuva. But ultimately, it is much more philosophical and cosmic sense, right? Schar va'onesh is actually part and parcel of man's ultimate end, and that's Olam HaBa. So, what I want to say is, in the Rambam, we have two concepts. We have concept which is called faith, and we have concept which is called philosophy, or philosophy, metaphysics, ontology, man's ultimate ontology. The Yud Gimel Ikkarim is man's faith. The halachas of man's faith. What does man have to believe in? That qualifies him to be part of this ultimate cosmic ontological process. But what? But ultimately, the faith is part and parcel of a greater spiritual cosmic process which defines man's purpose and the purpose of creation. And this is therefore embedded, right, in what I would say is the granting to man of intellect and free will. And by his use of free will, man's ultimate reward is Olam HaBa, where he intellectually connects with God, which represents man's ultimate teleological ontology and purpose of creation. That's really the answer to Professor Shapiro. So in other words, what we see is that the Rambam left out creation ex nihilo and left out schava oynish because he understood those in a much more general frame which defines the ultimate cosmic teleological destination of man, of which the laws of faith are only, you would say, halachic details, which enjoin man as part of this ultimate cosmic purpose. And that's what I would say is why he left out schava oynish. But, so therefore, what comes out is a very, very interesting thing. The Yud Gimel Ikarim, in a sense that, it's very interesting. I came to learn of a very interesting thing, which I thought I wanted to speak about. There's a very, very famous statement that's attributed to the Rav Soloveitchik, that you can't ask a question unless you already have an answer. This is a famous thing that's a tradition of the Briskes. It's brought, I think, in Matikah Shmua and Rabbi Dr. Arnson's book on Das Torah. He quotes this in English. And it is, Rav Soloveitchik wanted to claim that you can't ask a question until you already have an answer. Rav Soloveitchik brings a proof from the Akedah, but Avraham Avinu first asked the question after the angel told him, not to touch the knot. And that's we see that only after I know the answer can I ask the question. I recently read a doctoral thesis on the Chazon Ish by a certain Brown. It's recently been published as I think by Yeshiva University, because it was a law school, a very thick book on the Chazon Ish, which in my opinion is... What?
Magnus Press?
No, I don't think it's Magnus Press. I think it's Cardozo Law School, Yeshiva University. I have to recommend it. I think, in my opinion, it's probably the greatest biography of the Gadol that's ever been written. But actually, in this thesis, he has an interview with the very famous Talmud of the Chazon Ish. Is Dr. Tzvi Al Yehuda. I don't know if he's alive anymore, but actually, he actually learned with the Chazon Ish either every day or several times a week for several hours. Knew him very, very well as a young boy. I think later he emigrated to America and became a professor, a doctor, and he's written some piece for Tradition Magazine on Chazon Ish. There, Dr. Tzvi Al Yehuda says that he's interviewed by this Professor Brown, and he says that the Chaim would never made a statement like that. It's a stupid statement. He says his grandmother was there when Reb Chaim actually said that, was sent over this chiddush. Chas v'sholom, you can ask a question if you don't know the answer. Reb Chaim Soloveitchik was distinguishing between what he calls halacha and a promise. In other words, Kodesh Baruch Hu says to Avinu, "Ki yisli kol chazara." This will be your progeny. That's called a promise. But then he told them, "Bring him as an oila on a hamariyah." That's halacha. There's no contradiction. One's a promise, one's halacha. When the Malach told them, there's a contradiction in the halacha. That's when Avraham Avinu raises the contradiction. In other words, basically, what Tzvi Al Yehuda wants to say is, a promise and halacha are two different domains that have nothing to do with each other. A person cannot create from Judaism a philosophy based on promises. And that, I think, was his objection to what he understood to be the messianism of the Mizrahi Rav Kook. By the way, in this interview with him, because he was much of a admirer of Rav Kook, but that was his critique of what he understood to be maybe Rav Kook's philosophy. So, we have halacha and haftarah. Now, Tzvi Al Yehuda wants to say that the Chazon Ish understood the same thing too. Like I mentioned. A promise has nothing to do with halacha. I want to claim that this chiluk is actually in the Rambam. The Yud Gimel Ikkarim the Rambam are part of halacha. I'm calling Rabbi Soloveitchik in the one day to be published Philosophy of Judaism, which I'm still waiting for the Oyot to put out, which I've finished. The Yud Gimel Ikkarim are halacha. That's what I have to believe. Olam HaBa is a haftacha. That's a promise. believe in Olam HaBa. I have to believe in Hilchot Teshuva. So in other words, what has the Rambam done in Hilchot Teshuva? The Rambam has made, in the Rambam in Perek Gimel, the Rambam is telling me beliefs which are halacha. This is what I have to believe. And that's you can Ikarim. However, creation ex nihilo, which is the base of man's free will, which eventually lands man into Olam HaBa, which is the ultimate schar, that's a haftacha. That's a promise. A promise is an overall universal cosmic spiritual metaphysical process. But a person doesn't make that the basis of his halachic life. In his halachic life, a person has to believe in Techiyat HaMeitim. And as the Rambam says in his treatise on Techiyat HaMeitim, that a person doesn't believe in Techiyat HaMeitim, he's going to reject all the nisim. He's going to reject all the miracles. It's interesting, the Rambam's same lashon about believing Techiyat HaMeitim mirrors the same language in chapter 25, which speaks about believing in still in the concept of what? This is the concept of kadmos, of eternity. Section 2, right. What? The Rambam understood that Ikkarim is a very good part of the halachas. Tzchava halacha, you listen in the Ikkarim. But tzchava also is connected to the concept of a halacha promise. For this reason, he isn't really in past Olam HaBa, because Olam HaBa is halacha. So the Rambam, what I'm claiming is, in Hilchot Teshuva, is distinguishing between, is that what I call halacha and haftacha, which is between the halachas of belief and haftacha of a Kodesh Baruch, purpose of man. Purpose of man, for the Rambam, could have been something called hashkafa, like we call hashkafa, and it could possibly be that that's something that, like something which is too abstract for people to really understand what that is. One cannot envision it. Since Olam HaBa cannot envision it, you can't make it part of the halacha. It's too abstract, it's too deep, it's too philosophical. But belief in Techiyat HaMeitim is a halacha. A person like he believes in a maze can also believe in Techiyat HaMeitim too. And it's very, very interesting that what I'm saying after the Rambam says too. In the Rambam's Maamar Techiyat HaMeitim, the Rambam says in section Zion, section 7, I'm in the Kaladik, the Rambam says, how come I elaborate so much on Olam HaBa? I only give one sentence to Techiyat HaMeitim. The Rambam is partial. Techiyat HaMeitim, there's no depth to the belief. You believe it, that's enough. He says, Techiyat HaMeitim is derech ha'iyum. Techiyat HaMeitim is a philosophical concept. It's a concept of man's intellect devoid of his body. Says the Rambam, for this reason, I have to elaborate on Techiyat HaMeitim. So, what I want to say is that in here, in section 7, the Rambam's distinction between Techiyat HaMeitim, which is only a simple belief in a physical fact, a physical event, and Olam HaBa, which is a philosophical. There, the Rambam is expressing the dichotomy, the distinction between what I would call the halachas of belief and the philosophy of belief. And I claim that the Rambam understood that since the philosophy of belief, which is Olam HaBa, is ultimately the ultimate schar, so therefore the Rambam relegated schar v'oinish to the philosophical concept of Olam HaBa. As is in creation ex nihilo, he relegated that to Bechira Chavshis in chapter 5. But what I have to believe in is that God is capable of doing nisim. But not only creation ex nihilo, because the Rambam says in chapter 25 of section 2, I can believe the Platonic theory, but I'm not called an Ikkarim. So in other words, the Rambam understood that there is halachic belief and philosophical belief. Halachic belief is a Yud Gimel Ikarim. Philosophical belief is already the Yad, or actually the last 5 chapters of Hilchot Teshuva. So the first 4 chapters of Hilchot Teshuva are halachic belief, the belief in Teshuva, and the belief in those things which allow me to do Teshuva. But the philosophical, shiur, which is, of course, limited, which requires tremendous elaboration, that's chapters 5 to chapter 10, and that the Rambam summarizes and Bechira Chavshis, etc., etc. Yeah.
Changing subject slightly, does Rambam ever express or explain why, or the purpose of Techiyat HaMeitim, apart from being a belief in nisim?
No, it's just a belief. No, the Rambam, as far as the Rambam is concerned, is something that the Torah has promised, because I'll say it was promised, and I have to believe, and that's it.
But it doesn't seem to be any
No. It's a belief like an any nice, if it's a purpose belief, it means that a Kodesh Baruch Hu, has free will to change the world. But in other words, I can believe the Chis HaMeisim, I can believe the Chis HaMeisim, and believe the Platonic theory of eternity. That's fine too.
I understand.
But no. It's not.
God, I understand.
It's not a philosophical belief.
Why a neshama should want to come back and say?
It's a belief. It's a name the Torah has promised, and I believe like all this the Torah has promised. That's what I'm saying. And that's what I want to claim. He actually places it before Bias HaGoyel in Perek Gimel Hilchot Teshuva. It's a nice like every other nice. The Torah promised to believe it. It's part and parcel of belief in the Torah. Or belief in the Nevi'im. Same thing. I mean, the Nevi'im are coming to echo what the Torah says. So that's what I want to claim. Okay, so in other words, what I want to say is, and I think this is maybe a little bit of a conclusion, a fitting conclusion to the Yud Gimel Ikkarim. How are we to understand it seems to me the major problem in Ikkarim is understanding the believable Ikkarim, right? As opposed to what the Rambam believes in the guide from the Plagues, and also in parts of the Mishnah Torah. And this is the basis of all scholarship. All scholarship points out is that there are glaring contradictions between the Yud Gimel Ikkarim, 30% of faith, and between what arises in the Moira. And therefore, because of this, the different resolutions is that the Ikkarim is only made for Abaratzim, for the ignorant. That's the Abarbanel says like that. Or the Ikkarim are only meant to show that we have certain theology. It's also the Abarbanel. Or the Rambam speaking, the Rambam really believed in Yud Gimel Ikkarim, he was speaking to the Abaratzim, and really believed in the Or Nevuchim. In other words, these are all the different yeshuvah. It's very, very hard to accept a yeshuv like this when the Rambam says explicitly that, these are yeshuvahs, not only in the Don't Perish Mishnah in Parachelek, but he also speaks about this in the Maamar Techiyat HaMeitim. I want to claim that that's not true. There's a distinction that the Rambam is making between the halachas of belief and between the philosophy of belief, or between what the Chazon Ish, or Chaim would say, a promise, and between a halacha. Judaism is a religion of halacha, but it's also a religion which has a theology, a vision for man. But it's not Christianity that there's only a vision without halacha. And of course, only halacha without a vision. It's not orthoprax. But rather, Judaism incorporates both things. There's laws of what I'm supposed to believe in, and then there's a depth of understanding of the purpose of man. The Rambam in Yud Gimel Ikkarim was speaking alibad the hilchas. These are the halachas, what I have to believe in. The Rambam places these in Perek Gimel of Hilchot Teshuva, where the Rambam speaks about the laws of Teshuva. And the Rambam is telling you these are the laws, the halachas of things that I have to believe in. Philosophy, purpose, vision. That the Rambam placed in chapters 5 to chapters 10. There the Rambam is not really speaking halacha. There the Rambam is presenting to me the haftacha, the promise of the Torah, the vision of man, and how the vision in the Torah's understanding of man fits into man's ultimate purpose, which the Torah is promising, namely Olam HaBa. So in other words, there's no reason to use the contradictions between the Yud Gimel Ikkarim and the guide and the Mishnah Torah to create all different types of esoteric and exoteric theories of Maimonidean intentions and writings and controversies. Rather, this concept of between halacha and promise, Mekubalim would say between halacha and metaphysical processes of bihurim, exists in the Rambam too. Judaism is both a vision or philosophy of man's role and his purpose in the world, but it's also the laws which God has required man to do as part of God's Ratzon, God's will, and the human divine ethic. And this dichotomy is fundamental to Judaism, whether you're a medieval rationalist, whether you're a Mekubal, right? Whether you're the Chazon Ish and Chaim, right? This dichotomy expresses itself in different nuschais, different versions, but the dichotomy is always there, and this dichotomy is in the Rambam, and I think it's brought out most explicitly in this difference between Perek Gimel and Prokim Hey to Yud and Hilchot Teshuva, and that I think resolves the differences between what the Rambam is trying to accomplish in the Yud Gimel Ikkarim and what he tries to accomplish in the Meir and the certain parts of the Mishnah Torah. Yeah.
For Rambam, what is belief without philosophy? What does it mean to believe in something that has no
I'm not so sure.
philosophical
I'm not so
basis?
sure. I'm not so sure. I mean, if such a guy speaks about these things, I think it's hard for me
There's
to
a whole
say.
discussion about
The Rambam would say, very simply, that the Gemaras in Perek Chelek, in Sanhedrin, Tzadik Vav, are speaking about the halachas of belief. Who gets it to Olam, who gets to Olam HaBa?
Yeah.
In Daf Yud Zayin and Brachos, when Chazal say Atos B'Reishayim and Olam HaBa, they're speaking about philosophy. Well, the Rambam would say that already we see this distinction in Chazal. Sometimes Chazal speak about philosophy, and that's the deeper understanding of the Agadis of Chazal. And then some Chazal is speaking about beliefs, which are halachas. So in other words, in Perek Chelek, Chazal is speaking about the halachas of belief. Because they're telling me who's an Apikodos, who's not an Apikodos, who gets Olam HaBa, doesn't get Olam HaBa. That's halacha. But in Perek Zayin and Brachos, when Chazal is describing Olam HaBa, they're clearly using a mashal, a metaphor, which the Rambam understands as Soidis Misoidis HaTorah. The Rambam says this explicitly several places, including the introduction to the commentary to Perek Chelek. And there the Rambam would say that Chazal were engaged in two types of things. They were engaged in philosophy of belief and also in the halachas of belief. So the Rambam points in Chazal. Distinction expressed, I don't know. It's very interesting that the Rambam, many times, at the end of like halachas, the Rambam will actually give a philosophy. To me, the Rambam speaks about the Agila. Because the Rambam understood that there's halachas and then there's vision, there's philosophical depth and understanding and beauty. Both are parts of the Torah.
Yeah. Rabbi Triebitz has spoken a few times about the distinction between Mishnah Torah, he says the mitzvah is to know God, and based on the mistranslation in Perek Mishnah says mitzvah is to believe in God. Even, apart from the mistranslation, whatever. It sounds like there is a mitzvah of belief and there's a mitzvah of
right. No,
I don't see the Rambam expressing that really.
But I think he does. I think actually in Hilchot Teshuva in Perek Aleph, the Rambam is very interesting there. The Rambam speaks about the mistake of the philosophical debate. But according to the Rambam, no one punishes you for belief. I mean, if you believe things about God, but actually, we're expressing ourselves halachically is that if you pray, if you worship something other than the Kadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, for example, actually, I claim that in Hilchot Teshuva too. I'm not going to go into detail right now, but actually, we see a concept called a belief, and a concept, but the halacha is worshiping it. So, in other words, for example, if a person believes that God, that God created things, and that by honoring these things we honor God. The Rambam says that's called Ikkarim. But according to the Rambam, that's not halacha. Halakhically, I transgress avodah zarah when I worship something other than God, which is I think the fourth of the Ikkarim. So in other words, what I want to say that in even avodah zarah, the Rambam distinguishes between what's called the belief of avodah zarah and the laws of avodah zarah.
But in the Yud Gimel Ikkarim, that's talking about belief, and Rambam says there's
no, okay, fine. Okay, so that was Rambam's chiddush in Yud Gimel Ikkarim. I'm required to believe. Because the Rambam makes halacha to in Perek Beis of Avodah Zarah. The other Rambam says that I have to believe in God's incorporeality and also in His that He created. In other words, that's
a simple reading of the Ikkarim is that somebody who doesn't believe in one of the Ikkarim, there's a mitzvah to hate them.
Right, but that's halachic.
But it's halachic based on a belief, not based on an action.
No, so that's I'm just using. What I'm doing is I'm just using a that sometimes the Ram will divide things into beliefs into actions. So here too, I want to say the Ram will bring halachas of belief and the philosophy of belief.
We find also the Ram talks about belief.
That's what I want to claim. I want to claim is that this is the thing. Look, I want to claim that this distinction. We find that that's the way I was thinking Hilchot Teshuva. From Perek Hay and onwards, the Rambam is speaking about the philosophy of Teshuva.
There's no punishment from Hay onwards. There's no consequence of someone getting the belief wrong.
No, that's for sure. No, there isn't, because you can expect it. Since like the Rambam says in Maamar Techiyat HaMeitim, I think Olam HaBa is philosophical. You can't punish a person because every person has a understanding.
Whereas in the Ikarim, he is going to punish.
Right, because the Ikarim is called the laws of belief. But there's nothing in the Ikarim laws of belief which is beyond the person to believe, to understand. No, but Chesed Mason is a name. A world without a body, that's something that only the deep philosopher can understand. With Chesed Mason like Kriyas Shamsor, I'm compared to Kriyas Shamsor. That even in the Holocaust can believe. That's not it. Okay, with this I think we've ended the Yud Gimel Ikarim, 19 lectures.
Like Hirsch.
Now, 19 lectures, right? 19 lectures. It is true that 19 is a odd number, so is 13 too.
Prime number.
Right. 13 is also prime too. So in other words, it's always good to end with a prime number, like the Rambam ends with a prime number. Actually, I want to remind people that the Riemann hypothesis is still out there to prove that as a person goes on in real numbers, in integers, the number of prime numbers becomes less and less. If you actually prove that, you will win the $1 million Millennium Prize, which is being offered by some institute.
Bear in mind at shafacircle.com.
Right, and if you win it, right, bear in mind that I was the first person to alert you to this. If you can't prove that, you can prove some other million problems. I would like to say that next series will actually try to prove all your million problems, but that's not for a special outcome. Well, we know that once you learn these things, that the other things are very pashut. Just ask your friend from Avus and Yeshiva. But in any case, I hope that the Gimel Ikarim, these series of shiurim, have given some of you something to think about, and if people have new ideas or even argue with me, then Kol Yeschari, this will be my reward. And I want to thank you very much for listening. And with this, we conclude the Emir Hashem, the Gimel Ikarim. We are planning on Emir Hashem. This summer, we probably will. I don't think we'll be in any new series this summer. But in the answers of next year, with your encouragement, we hope to be to begin new types of shiurim in which we actually expand to other aspects of the Torah. And I wish you all a good summer, a nice vacation, and just I wish you meet again. From an undisclosed location, Yerushalayim Kodesh, Kol Tov.